Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Murphy, and I'm a Research and Policy Analyst with Social Justice Ireland, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon on behalf of my colleagues to our webinar on delivering a basic income pilot. So, as many of you know, Social Justice Ireland has been researching and advocating for a basic income for more than 3 decades. And the concept of a basic income, it's not new, it's been around for a long time, but it's a concept that has certainly gained significantly more traction in the past 2 years or more. And in fact, our 2016 policy conference discussed the theme basic income, radical utopia or practical solution. So I think it's wonderful for us to be here just 5 years later, actually looking at a practical solution and how a basic income pilot could be delivered in Ireland in January 2022. Now, there will be 5 presentations this afternoon. My colleagues Sean Healy and Colette will begin with the first 2 inputs. So Sean will give an overview of basic income in Ireland, detailing progress that has been made, and Colette will then outline the reasons why basic income is a good idea. Sean Ward will then present the details of how a basic income pilot could be delivered and implemented. Then we will have 2 respondents to Sean's presentation. So we have Angela Dorgan with us, CEO of First Music Contact, and Angela is also the current chair of the National Campaign for the Arts. So she will respond from the perspective of the arts community. And we have Michael Taft, an economist with SIPTU, who will give a response from a trade union perspective. This will be followed by a question and answer session. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will put them to the panelists, and any overall comments that you have, you can put into the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sean.
And thank you, Michelle. And it's, I'm just making sure I'm setting a stopwatch here so that I don't talk to beyond where I'm supposed to be. What I want to do in the next few minutes is basically just recap the history of basic income in Ireland, if you like. And it goes back to the 1970s, actually. In the late 1970s, the National Economic and Social Council commissioned Brendan Dowling to report on how personal income tax and transfers might be integrated. And that report examined 3 broad options, one of which was basic income. Now, Dowling's paper led to very little debate about basic income. However, a wide-ranging debate on tax reform did follow it, and that culminated in the establishment of a commission on taxation. And in its first of 5 reports, this commission on taxation rejected the concept of basic income, mostly on the grounds that it would cost too much. Now, subsequently, it emerged that the costings for basic income conducted by this commission were cursory, described in later years by a prominent participant in that commission as back-of-the-envelope calculations. They had done nothing of any substance, really. Now, a similar fate emerged for basic income from the Commission on Social Welfare, which reported in 1986. It too did no calculations of its own, but based its conclusions on the published position of the Commission on Taxation. So they said the Commission on Taxation said basic income can't be afforded, therefore we're taking that position as well. It also, the Commission on Taxation, or the Commission on Social Welfare, also decided not to analyse basic income because it believed that focusing on basic income would represent a distraction from what it considered to be its priority objective, which was increasing social welfare rates to adequate levels. And I suppose looking back on that 35 years later now, the Commission on Social Welfare's decision to focus on adequacy of social welfare rates can be seen to have borne little fruit, given that social welfare rates never reached an adequate level and are far from adequate to this day. But anyway, that gets us through the work that was done in the 70s and 80s. In the 90s, 2 approaches to basic income were developed in Ireland during that decade. Now, the first approach, which had work done by Patrick Honohan and by Tim Callan and his team in the ESRI. Honohan was separate. And they both preserved the key elements of the existing tax and spending systems. A second approach, which was developed originally by Sean Ward and then followed through by Bridget Reynolds and myself in Core Justice, and by Charles Clark and Catherine Kavanagh and John Healy and others, we basically substituted a basic income for the existing tax and welfare system. So basically there were 2 approaches to how to looking at basic income in Ireland through the 90s. Now, the models developed by Honohan and Callan were broadly similar. The way they saw it, that each adult of working age would receive an untaxed payment equivalent to that paid as unemployment assistance. Older people would receive a slightly higher payment, children would receive smaller amounts. All social welfare payments would be discontinued. Existing discretionary tax reliefs would be retained, and all government spending programs would also be retained. Now, both authors rejected this approach to basic income on the basis that it would be too costly. It would require a high tax rate of the order of 65% on income tax, and would be likely to act as a disincentive to taking up a paid job in their view. The other approach, as I said, originally developed by Sean Ward and followed by the rest of us that followed it, as I mentioned a minute ago, we sought to achieve the main benefits of basic income while reducing the cost. So the target was basically to keep the tax rate below 50%. So a full basic income would be paid to older people and children, and then adults of working age would receive, in the original proposal was that they would receive a substantial partial basic income because we couldn't afford a full basic income. Now, all discretionary tax reliefs would be abolished in this approach. A range of public expenditures would no longer be required, and this approach would provide more equity, both horizontal and vertical, and it would improve incentives to recruit labour and seek work, and it would provide greater simplicity and certainty. Now, Core Justice adopted this approach and developed it further, and they added a number of things, increasing the minimum income to the minimum rate recommended by the Commission on Social Welfare, restoring employers' PRSI at a reduced rate of 8%, and introducing additional anti-poverty payments. Now, Core Justice also commissioned a study to set out implementation strategies which could be put in place over a 3-year period. Now, this was aimed at addressing the problem that was sometimes raised that even if Ireland could pay for a basic income, it would not be possible to move from the current situation to a full basic income system. So Professor Charles Clarke and John Healy produced 2 studies in 1997, setting out a pathway that would lead to a full basic income system in Ireland. Now, in the build up to the general election in 1997, the Labour Party, which had been in government since 1992, included a commitment to producing a white paper on basic income in its election manifesto. However, following the election, they didn't form part of the new government. So Core Justice lobbied the incoming government to include a green paper on basic income in its programme for government, which it did. So that gets us through the 90s, into the noughties, 2000s. At the start of the 2000s, it was clear that vastly differing estimates had been put forward regarding the personal tax rate that would be required to fund a basic income system in Ireland. Estimates had ranged from 48%, which was Clarke and Healy in their study, to 65% or more that Callan and company had. So the Callan analysis had also cast doubt on the effectiveness of basic income in alleviating income poverty. So if the higher estimates of the tax rate were accurate, then basic income would not be viable. And if basic income would not address income poverty, then maybe there wasn't much point in developing it. Now, the government green paper on basic income, published in 2002, attempted to address those issues, the required personal tax rate and the impact on income poverty. It also examined other impacts, including the impact of basic income on participation in paid employment. The green paper basically contains a full basic income model with the following characteristics. Basic income payments were paid unconditionally, and payment amounts were aligned with social welfare rates, which they replaced. All tax expenditures were abolished. All farm income supports remained. Direct interest retention tax was set at 24%. That was the general level of it at the time. And employee PRSI and levies were abolished, but a social responsibility tax would replace employers' PRSI, and it was set at 8%. And this money was used to provide top-up payments to certain low-income individuals whose previous situation would not be covered by a full basic income. The Department of Finance estimate of the tax rate required to finance the proposal was 48% on personal income. So the Green Paper showed that a large majority of those living in poverty also would benefit from the basic income. So two definitive results emerged. The earlier very high estimates of the personal tax rate required to finance basic income was no longer applicable, and basic income would be effective in addressing income poverty. So then we move to the last decade, the 2010s, if you like. In this decade, Social Justice Ireland published a study entitled Building a Fairer Tax System, the Working Poor and the Cost of Refundable Tax Credits. And a refundable tax credit is one where if the income of an individual is insufficient to use up all of his or her tax credits, the remaining credit is paid to the individual by means of a cash transfer. A refundable tax credit can be a mechanism for implementing a basic income. So the study found that some 113,000 low-income workers would benefit from the proposal, and that the exchequer cost of the proposal would be 140 million per annum. Social Justice Ireland also presented a paper called Basic Income, Why and How in Difficult Times, Financing a Basic Income in Ireland, to the International Congress of the Basic Income Earth Network in 2012. And the context for that paper was the economic crisis in the EU and the series of decisions which had been made that seriously damaged Ireland's most vulnerable people and placed a disproportionate burden on their shoulders and seriously damaged the social infrastructure on which they depended. Now, the study reported that despite generous tax reliefs, only half of the workforce was covered by a private pension scheme. In addition, there was a number of, the basic benefits were all going to the, insofar as there were tax breaks, were going to those who were higher taxpayers. Only the highest earning 20% of pensioners, however, did not rely on the state pension for most of their retirement money. So given the ineffectiveness of generous tax reliefs in promoting pension coverage and the modest role of private pensions in supporting pensioners' incomes, the report recommended that the marginal tax rate of the rate of tax relief on private pension contributions should be reduced to the standard rate of 20%. And this measure would also apply to public service pension-related deductions. And that would be a strongly progressive change, as nearly 82% of the additional benefit flowing from tax reliefs went to the top 20% of earners. So basically, the idea was that you could pay for a basic income for everybody over the age of 65, and that it would be fully funded from within the changes in the tax system that were recommended. One final point before I conclude, to point out that over all of this period, two organisations have been to the fore in analysing and advocating for basic income in Ireland. That's Social Justice Ireland and Basic Income Ireland. Social Justice Ireland has been the source of most of the analysis of basic income in Ireland over the past 20 plus years. And in its annual publications, in its socioeconomic review, budget choices, the organisation has consistently argued that basic income represents a better option than the current system. It co-hosted the International BN Congress in Dublin in 2008, and basic income has featured prominently in several of its annual policy conferences, as Michelle pointed out in the introduction. As well as Social Justice Ireland, Basic Income Ireland has been in existence since the early 90s. And in fact, Basic Income Ireland was the first national affiliate to Basic Income Earth Network. And it co-hosted with Social Justice Ireland, the International BN Congress in Dublin in 2008. But from 2011, it has become much more active in hosting public meetings, writing papers and articles, leafleting, and engaging with the media. It hosts an annual summer forum on basic income featuring Irish and international speakers. And so I'll hand back to Michelle.
Thank you very much, Sean, for such a comprehensive overview in such a limited amount of time. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Colette Bennett, now to look at the reasons in favour of a basic income.
Thank you very, very much, Michelle. So I am going to try very hard to share my screen. Can everybody see that? Great. So as my colleagues have said, what I'm going to do is very quickly and very briefly go through, I suppose, why a basic income is a good idea. You know, the idea of a basic income, as Sean has very succinctly pointed out, is not new. You know, that idea that an income unconditionally granted to all on an individual basis without a mean test or a work requirement is something that we've been advocating for decades. At its core, a basic income is a guaranteed payment from the state to every resident on an individual basis without any means test or work requirement. And it's intended to provide a subsistence level lifestyle for everyone. It provides that floor of income below which no one should fall. And that safety net then provides for a number of other benefits. So just looking at the changing world of work, our economy is changing in many ways, and with the growth of various forms of part-time, precarious and different forms of self-employment over recent years, while the number of people employed is higher now than in most years since 2007, among these jobs, part-time employment has become a more frequent occurrence and now represents almost 1 in 5 jobs. Within those part-time employed, it's worth focusing on those who are underemployed, just this kind of number here. And there are people who are in part-time employment, but who are available and will be willing to work and want more hours than they currently have. By the fourth quarter, as I pointed out there, of 2020, that number was 101,400 people. So 4.4% of the total labour force were underemployed, and about a quarter of all part-time employees. Judged over time, the CSO labour force data suggests the emergence of greater number of workers in precarious employment situations. The growth in the number of individuals with less working hours than they would like, or as well as those with persistent uncertainties in relation to the number and the times of hours required to work, that's a major labour market challenge. And it's one which may grow in the period ahead and will likely to be. Aside from the impact that this has on well-being of individuals and their families, it also impacts their financial situation, and it adds to the challenges that are faced by the working poor. Changing technologies also mean that this trend is likely to increase. And a recent report from the European Parliament Research Service, while acknowledging that digital technologies can create the basis for higher living standards with less work, also recognised that they can lead to skills gaps, greater inequality and a more polarised society. They can also erode job quality by eliminating valuable skills, intensifying monitoring at work and extending atypical or gig economy. Employment in the future, in certain sectors at least, may be scarce as the impact of automation and globalisation are realised, not to mention the upcoming impacts of the fallout of COVID-19. So we in Social Justice Ireland believe that now is the time to adopt substantial measures, and as Sean and Michelle have both said, we've actually believed it for the last 30 odd years, to address and eliminate these problems and create a welfare system that is actually fit for purpose for the 21st century, for this economy and society. So one measure obviously being a basic income. Having that safety net of a basic income then also allows for flexibility to innovate without worrying about that complete loss of income. This allows prospective entrepreneurs to start up new businesses. It allows people to return to full or part-time education. It allows some to take time out for caring responsibilities, to care for children or sick or elderly relatives. Because you get to keep your basic income payment irrespective of your situation, individuals will know that they're always better off taking up employment. So this is not the case, obviously, with the current system, where the removal of welfare payments on starting a job can mean a reduction in household income, and people have to weigh that up. This leads to individuals needing to consider whether employment is worth their while, as their earnings are offset by both the cost of accessing employment and then the benefits that they lose. So basic income would therefore reduce and eliminate unemployment traps. It's also an enabler. It allows everyone the freedom to choose how to spend their time and how much of that time they want to spend in paid employment, in caring, in volunteering, in accessing education, in engaging in leisure activities and all of those things. It also gives people the choice to avoid jobs that they find unfulfilling or maybe morally or socially unacceptable. This improves the quality of living standards in Ireland. One of the objectives of the government's paper on well-being and the measurement of broader living standards in Ireland that was published with last year's budget 2021. And it will obviously also be part of a new social contract. So essentially all citizens contribute to the common good and should therefore be entitled to the proceeds of their society. Our shared responsibility of a society means meeting the basic needs of others. As society moves further away from the economy of the mid-20th century, when the foundations of most of the welfare states were developed, it's increasingly important that the state set minimum floors of income and services below which none of their citizens should fall. So robust and well-funded public services set the floor which underpins the living standards of most people. Accessible healthcare, high quality childcare, high quality education, a well-regulated housing sector, subsidised public transport, and other important contributions to essential services are things without which most citizens would have a real difficulty living. However, even in a situation where most of or all of these things are cheap or even free, individuals will have income needs to enable them to participate in society at a level considered the minimum social norm. This is why universal basic income and universal basic services are complementary policies. The narrative is often pitting one against the other, but that's not the case. They actually complement each other, and they're essential to ensuring that everyone in society has sufficient income and sufficient access to public services to live a life with dignity and experience living standards expected in a first world country. So the better the quality and the better subsidised the services, the lower the level of basic income that may be necessary. And finally, on this point, and possibly surprising for some, basic income also provides environmental benefits. So today, citizens are calling for social well-being and environment, as well as other goals, to take centre stage in public policy discussions. Not only is economic growth alone not enough to achieve these new public policy goals, but very often economic growth and full employment can be pursued in a manner which is contrary to this goal, but actually conflicts with it. So economists have started to redirect their attention to how social and environmental factors affect the economy and how the economy can then affect people, communities, society, and the planet. So basic income then facilitates a society and an economy that promotes environmental protection and the well-being of all. But it's not just us that's saying it. The idea of, money for doing nothing, or, it goes against many of our instincts as a society with criticism that it will make people lazy and encourage them to opt out. But international experience does not bear this out. In a Namibian village called, I'm going to get this wrong, I'm sure, Otafiero, there was a basic income style pilot project in 2005 where every resident under retirement age received 100 Namibian dollars each month. So that's about €6.50. What the outcome of that pilot found was, rather than make people lazy, independent, the payment basically transformed that village into a village of entrepreneurs. It freed people from spending their time trying to meet their basic needs so residents could focus on improving their living conditions. Some started small businesses, more children were enrolled in school, crime rates decreased, as did the rate of malnutrition. So there was nothing but good there. Similarly, in Manitoba in Canada in the mid-70s, a basic income pilot was undertaken, which saw participants paid between $300,000 and $500,000, approximately 16 to 20 in today's money. Now, the focus of this experiment was on low-income households rather than a universal representative sample. And the findings of this experiment are still proving very fruitful, and much has been written about it. But essentially, it led to a fall in hospital admissions and mental health consultations among participants. High school completion rates increased, particularly among males in low-income families. There was a reported reduction in teenage male early school leavers. Broadly speaking, the experiment found that adults with full-time jobs didn't reduce their working hours, with the exception of women who were facilitated to make more time or to take more time off after childbirth. But primary household earners rarely reduced their working hours. The most recent and possibly well-known experiment was that in Finland. So the results were published for this last year. And what that experiment did was provide a partial basic income of €560 per month to 2,000 randomly selected unemployed participants aged between 25 and 58. And the findings of this experiment found that basic income had better impact on employment than any of the obligatory employment activation models. So participants who received basic income reported improved well-being and cognitive abilities in every category measured, and there was no evidence to support the contention that basic income made people lazy. But it's also important to say what basic income isn't. It's not a sole means of alleviating poverty. Much more needs to be done in that space. It's not an alternative to publicly funded education and healthcare. It's not an excuse to withdraw other public services. Whether it would replace other payments to people at particular risk of poverty would depend on what level the basic income is set at, among other things. But generally, it would be the aim of the system that individuals on the margins of society or already in difficulty would not be made worse off. Policymakers must acknowledge that a thriving economy is not a goal in itself, but a means to social development and well-being for all. Substantial evidence has emerged in recent decades to support the view that economies and societies perform better across a number of different metrics, from better health to lower crime rates, where there is less inequality. The basic income, which provides a floor below which no one can fall, is a move towards creating a more equal Irish society. So we believe the time has come. And just to give a flavour of the many varied and extensive studies in this area, this is just a piece of the bibliography to my very short paper for today. And it's set out here, and here, and here, and here, and here. So really now is the time to act. It's time now to implement the pilot that government has already committed to in the programme for government. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Colette. And I suppose it's very worthwhile for people to remember why, the reasons for a basic income, the importance of having a minimum social floor, which the past 14 months has really brought home to us, and also what basic income isn't, and I think that's crucial. So thank you very much, Colette. And now I'd like to call on Sean Ward to give his presentation on the basic income pilot itself and how you might deliver a basic income pilot.
Okay, thanks, Michelle, for that. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is present a proposal from Social Justice Ireland, which is designed to aid the rollout of the pilot. Now, it's worth saying that we have a major opportunity at the moment. Never before have we had a commitment in the programme for government to actually run a pilot. Never before have we had a group of people, that is to say artists, who actually want to participate in the pilot, and on foot of that report from the Recovery Task Force. And in putting this before you, we welcome all comments and suggestions for improvement. Okay, so we think there's a threefold purpose of the pilot. Firstly, to provide a secure basic income. Secondly, to adjust and develop the UBI model in the light of experience. And thirdly, to assess the potential of UBI as a permanent scheme for artists and also for extension across society. Okay, so we now go on to the outline of what the model would look like. Okay, and this is the bones of my talk today. We're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to cover eligibility, the payments, the implications for social welfare entitlements, the income tax that will be payable, implications for spouses, the number of participants, the likely cost, evaluation, legislative changes, governance, proposed timeline, and conclusion. Okay, so there's a fair bit to be covered there. So we'll go on straight away to eligibility. Okay, now, first thing to say is that we're not experts in how to define an artist, okay? But here are some ready-made eligibility criteria which derive from the existing social welfare scheme for professional artists on job seekers allowance, over 18, habitual residents, certified member of professional organisation, self-employed, and half your income must be artistic. On the next slide, we just show the recognised professional disciplines and certified organisations in that social welfare scheme for professional artists. Okay, and then we go on to the next slide, which is the actual payments. Okay, so we're suggesting a 4-year duration for the pilot. That's to enable the pilot to be, the effects to be successfully monitored. The level of payment is €203 a week, which is aligned with the job assistance scheme. And a particular feature of the model is that UBI is withdrawn from very high earners. And of course, the reason for that is that they don't actually need it. Okay, so now we look to other social welfare entitlements. And while universal basic income would replace many social welfare payments, it doesn't remove the need for many others. For example, the back to school clothing and footwear allowance. Some of these payments will be reduced and turned into supplements on top of the UBI. For example, maternity benefits, which is paid at a higher rate. These supplements will be carefully calibrated so that no one on a low income loses out. Similar considerations apply to the CNUAS payments, which are paid to some members of Eastána. These will be reduced carefully so that low income recipients of CNUAS do not lose out. Okay, on the next slide then, we look at the income tax PRSI USC, and we're talking about turning them into a single composite tax. Okay, so we're showing some key elements of the proposal. The single composite tax will comprise income tax PRSI and USC. The first bullet says that total income will be the sum of market income and UBI. The initial tax rate then will be very low and will not be levied when the only income is the basic income. Once the total income exceeds the basic income, tax will apply and the rate of tax will increase progressively in accordance with total income. Now, the maximum effective tax rate, no matter how high your income, the maximum effective tax rate, that is to say, the tax you pay divided by your market income, will be 50%. There'll be no credits or allowances of any kind allowed in the tax system, and of course that includes the artist exemption. And the reason for that is that, of course, the removal of these exemptions is part of the way that this is funded. And lastly, the participants will be credited with Class A PRSI contributions. So how about if we go on now and look at some examples? All right, there are three tables here. We'll look at the first table, which is about the current system. And the first row there shows market income ranging from 5,000 up over on the right-hand side to 40,000. At the present, the income tax PRSI and USC are paying us on the second row, and it ranges from 0 over the left-hand side up to a maximum of 8,343 on that table. And the net income is what's left. So it ranges from 5,000 on the left up to 31,657 if your market income is 40,000. So that's the current system, right? How would UBI look? That's the second table. We have the same market income all the way across from 5,000 to 40,000. The UBI then is 203 euros a week, which is 10,593 per annum, and we show that in the second row. The third row is the composite income tax that you would pay from 2,695 up to 16,909, and the net income is what you're left with, which is, you know, after the benefit of the UBI and after paying your composite income tax, you're left to 12,897 over on the left, or 33,684 over on the right-hand side. Now, the last line, the last bit of the table is, of course, the significant one. What's the difference? Well, if your market income was 5,000 euro, the difference is 7,897 euros. And if your market income is 40,000, the difference is 2,927. Okay, so these are examples. The actual paper contains further examples showing income from 5,000 all the way up to 500,000. Okay, so we move on then to the next slide, which is the implications for spouses and cohabiting partners. Okay, well, if spouses can participate in the pilot, then both partners are treated equally in the pilot, okay? But if they're not in the pilot, well, from a social welfare perspective, they'll be treated as dependent adults. For income tax PRSI and USC, they'll be assessed individually. They will get the single tax credit and the employee tax credit. They can avail of other tax allowances, but there won't be any joint assessment. Now we go on to slide 11. And this is about the number of participants, okay, and the exchequer cost. Okay, the pool of eligible artists and performers is taken as 14,200. This is the number of people in the arts, entertainment and recreation sector who were in receipt of PUP at the height of the first wave of the pandemic on the 5th of May 2020, okay? Now, we're not the business of deciding who an artist is, but this is a readily available figure. There are two options here. Under option 1, online applications will be invited from eligible artists and performers. Applicants will be asked to confirm that they will facilitate research of the pilot by cooperation with survey and interview requests and allowing their administrative data, such as revenue and social welfare, to be used. If 14,200 eligible participants apply and are accepted into the pilot, the annual exchequer cost could be around 27 million euros. A key benefit of this option is that many artists and performers will be able to avail of the advantages of UPI. The second option, under option 2, online applications will be invited from eligible artists and performers. Applicants will be asked to confirm they will facilitate research of the pilot, whether or not they are selected, by cooperating with survey and interview requests. Applicants who fulfill the criteria will be selected based on the date and time of application. Quotas for age and gender will be applied so that the pilot is representative of the population. A matched comparator group will also be selected. If the pilot is 3,000 artists and performers, the annual cost will be around 5.3 million. A key benefit of this option is that comparisons are possible between those artists and performers on universal basic income and those artists and performers who are not on basic income. The next slide then is about evaluations. So 2 types of evaluation are proposed. The first is formative evaluation. This is about tweaking the pilot, ironing out anomalies and making administrative improvements based on the views of participants and administrators. The second type of evaluation is summative evaluation. That's about casting the cold eye. A range of variables, both hard and soft, many of them are listed there, will be monitored to assess the impact of the pilot on the participants. And the views of the participants will be very important in the summative evaluation also. Now, slide 13, the next slide, is about legislative changes. Okay, so it's likely that some legislative changes will be required to facilitate the pilot. These will be identified by revenue and social protection, and they'll be included in the finance bill and the social welfare bill as required. Now we move on to governance. Okay, we're proposing that the pilot will be administered by a dedicated unit within the revenue commissioners, and that the pilot will be overseen by a steering group chaired by a person such as Claire Dignan, chair of the Arts Recovery Task Force, and representing the following organisations. This is subject to review and subject to agreement: the Department of Arts, the National Campaign for the Arts, Department of Finance, Department of Social Protection, ICTU, Irish Theatre Institute, Revenue Commissioners, Low Pay Commission and Social Justice Ireland. And the secretariat will be provided by the Department of Media, Tourism, Arts, Culture, Sports and the Gaeltacht. We want to look now at the role of the steering group, because this is really very important. What would they do? Well, the first thing they do is they'll draft the scope and the rules of the pilot for approval by the Minister and the government. Second thing they'll do is they'll oversee the implementation. Thirdly, they agree adjustments to the operation of the pilot based on the formative evaluations. They commission research of the pilot, and they produce an annual report on the operation of the pilot and research findings. In our view, establishing the steering group is the very, very first thing that needs to be done. Okay, let's go on to a proposed timeline. Okay, suppose we wanted to go live on the 1st of January next. That's about 7 months away. Following are some key milestones for going live on that date. In May, this month, we set up the steering group. It's appointed and commences its work. From May to July, this proposal is discussed and modified by the steering group, and a memorandum goes from the Minister of Arts to the government by the end of July. From August to October, the Revenue Commissioners and Department of Social Protection prepare legislative amendments that will be required in the Finance Bill and the Social Welfare Bill. Revenue establish a unit to implement the pilot and commence IT preparations. The steering group oversees all preparations for the pilot, including publicity and engagement of researchers to evaluate the pilot. And in November and December this year, applications are invited from artists and performers, and their eligibility is assessed. And then next year, and the year after, what you would do is January to December, the pilot's up and running. Minor modifications are considered and agreed by the steering group if indicated by formative evaluations. And the steering group prepares an annual report to include the results of the evaluations. In the following year, 2023, as for the previous year, summative evaluation will now have access to full year data, which would be an important addition. And going on then further out in the 4 years, in the next year, 2024, further research carried out into the implications of extending UBI across society using the results of the evaluations. That additional research will include consideration of a whole lot of variables that are listed there, but the research will also cover other areas, including the exchequer implications of extending UBI across society, the likely impact on labour supply and distributional consequences. And then we go on to look at conclusions. Well, in Ireland, as has been pointed out both by Colette and by Sean, there have been many studies, papers, seminars, and much speculation as to how basic income would work and what the effects of basic income might be. Ultimately, the biggest element in these activities has been conjecture. Like the novice swimmer, tiptoeing around the edge of the swimming pool, wondering, will I drown? Will it be cold? Will I float? Will I be good at this? The only way to find out is, yeah, you know, enter the water. The proposed UBI pilot for artists and performers provides the first opportunity in Ireland to find out the answers to many of the questions which have been speculated about over a very long period. And early and considered implementation of the pilot will be key to getting the answers. Okay, so Gurmagat and anybody, any questions? We'll try and deal with them. Thank you very much.
Sean, I think that was a very comprehensive presentation of the pilot, and I suppose the key element there, Sean, is that after many years of research and speculation and questions, now we have the opportunity to actually evaluate a pilot and find out what the impacts might be. Now, just a reminder to those of you who joined late and some of our international audience, I'm not sure if you got in first, to put your questions in the Q&A function there. There's a chat function as well for people to introduce themselves, make some comments, but specific questions, please put them into the Q&A function so we can get to them after the two respondents. So next up we have Angela Dorgan, CEO of First Music Contact and the current chair of the National Campaign for the Arts, to give us a response on Sean's presentation from the perspective of the arts community.
Thanks, Michelle. Can I use the analogy that's been used about the jumping in the water? Can I just assure everybody that there are no better lifeguards than the two Seans, and acknowledge the work of Social Justice Ireland and indeed Basic Income Ireland and their support of NCFA over the last number of years, as we push UBI to the front of our asks of government on how the arts sector might be better supported. I suppose I'm going to keep my responses short, but also bring this incredibly comprehensive and helpful presentation to the wider sector. We have a meeting with the wider sector today, but I'll put some context on where NCFA are at the moment. We are a voluntary organisation representing the needs and wants and necessities of the arts sector in Ireland for artists, arts workers and arts organisations. Where we are with UBI is it has been in our programme for government recommendations for this will be our 5th year, and we would acknowledge that the decades of work done by people like Social Justice Ireland and Basic Income Ireland have been incredibly useful in assessing where and how artists might best benefit from UBI. It's unfortunate that I'm able to tick all the boxes of those in danger as outlined in Sean Ward's report. The arts is still below the European average of how the arts is funded, although to her immense credit, Minister Catherine Martin has taken very large steps in a very difficult year to address that, and we hope she will continue to do so. We see basic income for artists as a necessary next leg to hold up the table of the arts. A couple of key things to acknowledge. When Colette talked about underpaid and overworking, that 104,000, we would absolutely argue that the entire art sector lives in there. If you think about artists like musicians, playwrights, poets, authors, a lot of the work that they bring to their output is invisible and unpaid work. So a theatre director may work on a piece of theatre for 60% of their time in any given year, but 40% of that is unpaid work. An album can take up to 3 years to get from concept, and let's acknowledge that artists take something out of the ether and make it into something beautiful for all of us to enjoy. And a lot of that work, say for a musician, is in the concept, rehearsing, recording, and it could be 3 years before artists see an income from that, before a writer sees an income from a book, before a poet would see an income from sales or bookings, and so on. So just to acknowledge that the arts is for those and other reasons, also in the most precarious situation. We're also precarious in that there's a distinct lack of research. The only immense credit to Theatre Forum and ITI for the research they have done on this, but Theatre Forum's report on the wage, the most recent report on the wages of those working in the arts, had artists consistently and repeatedly at near poverty and below poverty levels, out of the health system. You know, really, you know, not many people in our sector can afford private insurance at all. We're really precarious in areas like housing, health, and all of those areas. So there are a massive reasons why the arts are a good pilot, all of those included. A couple of just quick responses to the presentation today. 3 key responses from us as a sector. We would replace artists and performers with artists and arts workers. I think it's important to acknowledge that the people who will need basic income and the support it might offer are those who make art, but also those who support them to bring that art to a place where they can then make money from it. So sound engineers, producers, you know, set designers, theatre directors, choreographers. So those who work immediately outside the individual artist and performer to get that performance to a stage where it can help and support people to make an income. So that would be our first recommendation, that would change. The second overarching recommendation that is made, that we would, I suppose, question, is the amount of money. We were a part of the task force that was chaired by Claire Dignan, and I can happily say that all 19 members of that task force were unanimous in their support that basic income for artists be the one hill we would all die on, if you like, and that it was a real, that as the pilot, the government agreed on this in their programme for government, that the arts should go after that, and it should be the arts who be considered for that. The qualification, I think we would recommend that as many artists and arts workers as possible would be included for a pilot or a trial to work. I think we should, artists in their every single day life have to qualify themselves, and we joke, but it's not too far from the truth, that the artists are repeatedly put in a Hunger Games situation where there is a small pot of money but a large demand for the support, so that the grant system for individual artists and arts organisations remain in place and be replenished and improved and increased to at least the average, the European average, but that this basic income is that third leg, so that people are free to work. So I think the amounts as set out by Sean, by both Sean's, and we'll have to come up with a collective name for them. I think the dynamic duo is what we refer to them as, but I think what is important is that what that offers a large people of the sector, if you come back to the scenario where a lot of artists, it takes 3 years to make an income from their arts, that basic income is a cash flow support. Because what we see is in the 3 to 7 to 10 year idea of this pilot is that it ends up in taxation, in improvement of work, in improvement of output, in that big kind of, you know, if you don't have to worry about your everyday income, the freedom that gives you to develop more work, to sell more work, to you know, to be engaged in more work, we would see that basic income would end up paying for itself in taxation in the sector. So we wouldn't be behind the idea that this should be a qualitative trial. We think it should be inclusive and be an opt-in, and artists should be, and arts workers should be allowed to opt into this pilot, and that revenue and the arts sector together come up with a way of how that could work. And I think the key here is that there's a huge opportunity here for Ireland as a society and a republic to put its money where its mouth is. We talk all the time about how much we support our artists. Imagine if we are the country that drives basic income into the 21st century, that trials it with an entire sector and that sticks with it for a length of time, that can really take it then and bring it into areas like small farming, like fisheries, and I suppose professions that are alongside us and that have been at the center of the need for basic income in society for the last 3-4 decades. It's not a new concept. So I think the final, I suppose, recommendation that was made is around the makeup. We have an update ourselves from our meeting with the department last year about the makeup of the Oversight Committee for Basic Income, and it will be the same group that will have been charged with the implementation of the rest of the elements on the task force. And we understand that that Oversight group will be chaired by Conor Falvey in the department. And that the Oversight group then would include the Department of Enterprise, the Department of Finance, the Department of Social Protection, the Department of Public Expenditure, Department of Health, the Director of the Arts Council, the City and County Managers Association would be represented, and that's what we understand. We also have been asked to be available to, as the NCFA, to feed into that process, and we happily would be. We've been engaging with Alex Piggott from the Greens Green Party Policy Group all along, and I think that's where NCFA would be of best use. Working with the sector, we have our own sectoral meeting at 2:30 where we will be responding to this further, but also asking the sector itself, because they will be the sector that will be tested, asking them how and when and who might be assessed and who might be included, and how we help this task group and this oversight group come to the conclusions that are the fairest for artists. I think we would stick also by the amount, just on the recommendation, that the number is closer to the number in the task force, which is 327 a week, which is in and around the minimum wage. And I suppose that would be where we would stand on this. There were a couple, I think Sean Healy's history is just so comprehensive and so useful about where this has come from. I think Sean Ward's presentation on the figures shows, and it's that kind of information is really useful for us to share with with the sector about whether they want to opt in or not, because we can't assume that every artist will want to do that, but it is important enough for this to be available as something that would go alongside that our governments continue to fund work to be made, but that basic income for artists would fund and support the worker. And we, again, just to reiterate that we would say it's artists and arts workers should be supported in that.
Thank you very much, Angela, for a very comprehensive response, and you make the point very, very well on the precarious situation that artists have found themselves in, not just in the past 14 months, but for a considerable period of time, and the issue in terms of wages in the sector itself. And I think also a very, very comprehensive overview of how the task force came to their recommendation and conclusion, but also I think the point you made about using it then to open out to different sectors, and the different sectors you referenced, will be vitally important going forward. And that's why it's so important that we actually do implement the pilot. And finally, I'm going to call upon Michael Taft, economist with SIP2, to give his response from a trade union perspective.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, and thank you to Social Justice Ireland for inviting me to comment on Sean's paper, which does a very good job of fleshing out the generalized proposals that came from the task force regarding a basic income trial in the arts sector. I think there's four particular strengths of Sean's proposals. Well, first off, it is a pilot of those working in the sector. A number of basic income trials throughout Europe and throughout the US have focused primarily, if not exclusively, on the unemployed, which is a fairly selective intervention into the labor market. One of the strengths of basic income, to my mind, is the way it can impact positively on those on low and average incomes, those on precarious contracts, casual workers, those who are in and out of active employment and sometimes struggle to stay in. In many cases, that can be due to the lack of social supports in the community. In that sense, a basic income or other types of basic income can give people in work not only more stability, not only more income, but it can also provide them more power that they can leverage in the workplace or the economy as a whole. And I think we're going to see that in the upcoming few weeks, where we have the interaction of employers, for instance, claiming that they're finding it difficult to attract full-time and part-time workers back into work, especially in the retail sector. And that is coinciding with the phasing out of the pandemic unemployment payment. So what you could have is a terrible situation, especially as it impacts on young people, of people actually essentially being forced for financial means to go into low-paid and precarious employment. So therefore, this goes beyond just merely an anti-poverty measure or an anti-red tape measure, but we can actually, through the trial, see how it impacts on working relationships in workers' favor. I think the proposal to tax UBI is particularly progressive, or the basic income payment is particularly progressive. Now, I know some may oppose this because they fear that it may detract from the universality of basic income, but I think there's an argument that says a taxation of a universally distributed benefit does not undermine its universality. And in fact, it can get over this objection, say of paying Michael O'Leary the same amount as someone on low pay. It's kind of one sense, a silly objection, because that happens anyway through tax credits. Senior executives get as much tax credits, personal tax credits, through the current system as somebody on low pay but above the income tax threshold. So in that sense, it can get over that objection. It can reduce costs and reduce pressures on tax rates. Also, I mean, and again, I'm open to correction, but it seems to be that this is a move, that the proposal seems to be a move towards a variant of basic income, namely a participation income, given the conditionalities involved, and in some cases, the inevitable conditionalities involved. Now, I don't see this as a weakness in the proposal. I see it as a strength, because a participation income was proposed as kind of a halfway house between the current system and basic income. So we shouldn't necessarily see it as maybe kind of an uncomfortable compromise or a staging post or whatever between supporters of the former and supporters of the latter, but rather as a door opener that can gain support from those who otherwise might be hesitant towards basic income. So in that sense, it doesn't commit anyone to change their mind, but it can open up a wider debate regarding a strong, rational income floor, and in this case, particularly in the arts sector. And the final advantage is it's cheap. That's always good. Even at the high end of 27 million euros a year, it's a good deal. It's value for money. And if it is possible to pick up the second round effects, things like increased consumption, reduced welfare, reduced social protection expenditure, impact on incomes, we may find that the cost of running this pilot is literally pennies behind the sofa. There are three issues I would like to raise, and possibly Sean might like to respond to them afterwards, or someone else from social justice. The first one is the ability to extrapolate from the experience of arts workers under the scheme and apply it across the board. And there's two things here. First off, why are employees excluded? Employees in the arts and what's called the arts and entertainment sector, nearly a third of employees are officially categorized as low paid, and many of them are on precarious contracts, in particular temporary work contracts. It would seem to be that employees would benefit as much in this sector if they fulfill the other criteria, all things being equal, as those on self-employed. Again, is there something particular to the issues that arts workers faces that are different enough, that are different for workers in other sectors, that might make that ability to apply this across the board more difficult? For instance, in many of the art subcategories, own account workers, freelancers, or essentially self-employed, make up 60 to 70% of all the people in employment. And they would make up 100% in terms of this trial if employees are excluded. You know, there are common narratives that employees and self-employed both experience, such as precarious and low-paid work. So, you know, I think that particular issue in terms of the employees being excluded, but also to what is the proposed ability to take what we've learned in this particular sector and apply it, say, in the retail sector or in the hospitality sector or the transport or what have you. Secondly, to help overcome hesitation to different types of basic income, I've always thought it's helpful that a policy or a pilot of a policy in this instance can be shown to emerge out of existing practice or can fit in without too much change with the current system. For instance, I mean, Sean Healy mentioned earlier refundable tax credits. To my mind, that's a no-brainer. It would be seen as fair by people, and it already exists in our system, in the corporate tax system, through refundable R&D tax credits. So, you know, something should emerge out of the existing practice or fit in, you know, without too much bother into the current system, or is not unnecessarily complicated. For instance, is there a need to move away from the current tax structure towards a composite rate of 20, if I understand the proposal right, of 20 and 30%? Is that essential to the principles of the pilot, or is that done to raise the revenue so that the pilot scheme isn't as expensive? I would think that the more conservative the steps in a policy or trial rollout, the more conservative the steps we take, the more radical ultimately can be our ultimate destination. If keeping the current tax system, and by the way, I'm not a fan of the current tax system, but if we keep that, then the cost would still be minimal, given the second option regarding control groups, which I'll come back to in a minute. And again, if we can get the impact of the taxation of basic income payments along with the second round effects, we might find that the cost is very minimal if we stay, broadly speaking, within the same system. And again, is the withdrawal of the basic income payment necessary at the top, at the, you know, the over the 100,000, 200,000, given one, that the basic payment is taxed, and two, how likely is it that high income earners in that sector would opt to go into the system in the first place? I can understand the optics of it. Again, to get away from that, you're giving the same amount of money to those who don't need it, etc. So if for that reason, it may well be necessary to keep it. But again, is it necessary to the principle of the project itself? Finally, there's the issue of a control group. Now, in the first option that's used, where participation in the trial is available to all who want to join, who fulfill the criteria and the conditions. However, in that respect, you couldn't have a control group because, you know, it would be just those who opted out of it. And so you would not have a like-for-like comparison. I think that the second option, which is that there would be a selection, say 3,000 or whatever the number might be, and a similar selection of those not participating as the control group, and to balance them on a like-for-like basis would be the preferable way to go. Also, as I said earlier, in that case, you may not have to move or readjust the tax rates so significantly because the cost itself would actually fall under a pilot project of just 3,000. Now, these issues I've raised can be addressed in the framework of Sean's model. And by the way, some of the issues I've raised may, on further reflection, not be an issue at all. I mean, one should always acknowledge one's ability to get it wrong, and hopefully I do that all the time. But I'd like to say, just from a personal point of view, as someone who's worked for a long time in the trade union movement and has tried to has argued for a constructive engagement between trade unionists and supporters of basic income or the variants of basic income, because sometimes that dialogue has not been as constructive as one might hope. It certainly gives me great pleasure the fact that on the task force one of our officials was on the task force, Karen O'Loughlin, who was the official for arts members of SIPTU. And of course, as Angela said, it was a unanimous proposal. We supported the proposal on the Arts Council for this trial income. So hopefully that will bring about further mutual discussion and involvement in this key policy area on behalf of trade unions. Thank you for that. Thank you, Michelle.
And thank you, Michael, for such a comprehensive response. And I think both Michael and Angela have raised issues that have come up. Most of the issues that have come up in the Q&A have actually been raised by Michael and Angela, which is great. Now, I'm conscious that Angela has to leave us at 2:20 to go to another meeting. So the first question I'm going to throw out there was raised by Angela as well. I'm going to try to the panelist that, the rate recommended by the Arts and Culture Recovery Task Force was 327 and the rate in the pilot is 203. So I might ask Sean to respond then in terms of the difference between the two rates and how you might see that being made up.
That's me, Michelle, you're talking about there.
Either yourself or yes.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's fair enough. Yeah. No, it would be possible to incorporate the extra 120 euros or whatever as a kind of an artist income, specifically artist income, which would be on top of the UBI. But in terms of universalizing the thing, we certainly couldn't afford to pay an extra 100 euros on top of UBI to the whole population. Okay, that's not possible. But it would be possible for the arts sector to make a case that because of their unique circumstances or whatever, and they did that in the task force already, so it's something that's been done already, that they would get an extra income. That in terms of the model, that would be like market income. It'd be like an extra 100-odd euro of market income on top of the UBI, and that would go through the tax system of the model. So that's perfectly possible to do.
Thanks, Sean. Now, another issue which has come up consistently in the Q&A and has been raised by Michael, I suppose there's two issues. Number one, there's the issue of the 50% of market income, the impact of COVID on that and how difficult it would be for people to reach that eligibility. And is there room for manoeuvre there? There's a question around income from lectures. And then the issue that Michael raised about, I suppose, the terminology and should the pilot be available to arts workers as opposed to the artists and performers outlined. So I'll ask Sean Healy and then Sean Moore to respond to those.
If I the first question again, just remind me. First one. The
first one, Sean, I suppose was the market income issue, perfect, the 50% of market income.
I've actually provided an answer for this for various people that asked it privately in the chat already. That's for us not a condition. It's basically that was part of the social welfare way of measuring the thing. and that was there already. But like, if you were to look for 50% of their income had to come from arts in the last 12 months, sure, nobody would qualify. Well, there might be, Bono might qualify, and a few people like that, but there wouldn't be very many people qualifying. So in actual fact, like, that was simply setting out what was there already. But but if you look at the answer to the second question provides the space, I think. Like, where we're concerned, like Angela suggested that we replace artists and performers with artists and art workers, that's not a problem at all. What that will do is basically, like Sean Ward started out by pointing out, that we're not experts in deciding who artists are or who qualifies and these kinds of things. But we did need some kind of ballpark figure on which to do calculations. Otherwise, you can't do a calculation that's real. So we went with the numbers that were there, that were available. But from the point of view of a pilot being run nationally by government, artists and art workers, no problem whatsoever. There was a third suggestion, or a third item that you mentioned, Angela, that I would urge extreme caution on. You said that you had been given a list of people who would be on the oversight group by government. It had mostly government civil servants on it. Just to fill you in a bit, having done a lot of work on refundable tax credits 20 years ago, and like Michael, I consider it to be a no-brainer as well. And I was on a government working group, many of whom thought it was a no-brainer. But the calculations that were done for us, you know, that working group, by the way, was under the chairmanship of the Department of Finance, had revenue on it and so on. The calculations that were done on it, and that were done for the group, were not based on a proposal that anybody made. They were based on something that Revenue and Finance dreamt up, and which cost an arm and a leg, with the result that the proposal never was looked at in serious. It was just dismissed because it cost billions to implement it, despite our objections to the fact that the calculations were problematic. Now, 10 years later, Social Justice Ireland commissioned a study to actually do those numbers, and found that the numbers were the actual cost was 5% of what the calculated cost that had been repeated for 10 years in answer to PQs in the Dáil. Okay, now the committee that was dealing with the Oireachtas committee brought in Revenue and Finance to deal with this, and the first thing they did in their first opening presentation the day they came in was they had looked at the numbers again, and they had discovered that it was actually much, much lower. It was only about 15% of what they had actually been telling PQ respondents for 10 years the actual cost had been. Now, not alone that, they were then asked, would they meet with our team to put it together to see, like, could we compare and contrast how the thing was done? We said, absolutely. We met with them, and within an hour, they had further reduced their estimate. They'd cut it in half. Why? Because they had been continually including things that weren't in it at all. Now, the point I'm saying to you is, be very, very careful about an oversight group made up of almost total insiders, or totally made up of insiders, that doesn't have the capacity on it to actually do these numbers and verify anything that is put in front of them.
Yeah, I mean, our conversations today, Sean, have been obviously, you know, the expertise that you guys brought to our information and our work on the task force. You know, it was Basic Income Ireland's and your maths, for want of a better word, and that's what we informed the task force with. So it's on record that you as organizations are where the expertise can come from in the sector. I would be confident enough, but I would, you know, we've been in this game a while, so we know to keep you know, and I think that's why someone like NCFA is of larger, I think, benefit externally, so that we can provide a commentary and context. But I would also add that in our conversations with the department and with the senior and other civil servants in the department, that their absolute approach to all of this is that it's collegiate rather than prescriptive. And that they would be looking to the sector, both in the area of those who have done work in the areas of unions and in the areas of representative or sectoral organisations, ourselves and others included, that I didn't get the feeling, and I might be naive, but I hope to think it's not naivety, that this is, I think everyone notices the opportunity here and no one wants to get it wrong. So I think there is openness, and we, you know, to the end where they've asked us to be available every 2 weeks for testing and for feedback for that group. And to their credit, we did quite a lot of work with the Greens policy group, and they did quite a lot of work in their understanding of this while bringing it to the Green Party, and for our minister then to bring it to her colleagues. I will just add, before I go, that we, as part of our push for UBI, we're taking a three-pronged approach to this. A very important push is hearts and minds in the wider society, that people accept that the arts is a good pilot for this basic income trial. The second is to make sure that work done in the sector by people like you and Basic Income Ireland is, and I mean it, we are standing on your shoulders when we're pushing this. But the third element of that is to bring the political parties with us. We've been meeting the leaders and art spokespeople of the parties, and of those we've met so far, there does seem to be universal, pardon the pun, support for this pilot and trial. So I do think, apart from any other moment in time, and as Michael and yourselves have acknowledged, I think it's a very interesting but also very exciting, and probably one of the best times that a trial like this can be brought forward. From all three of those areas, we've experienced a great support. There is work to be done, absolutely, by all of us on who and how. But I think the if, or the item of basic income for artists, or universal basic income, is definitely, the appetite seems to me anyway to be the best point in time than it has been in a very long time.
Thank you, Angela.
Could I just add one sentence there, because I didn't do it earlier, but it's important in the context of what you said. In preparing for the programme for government, which is now in place, of the current government, it should be acknowledged that both the Green Party and Fianna Fáil had included commitments on basic income in their election manifestos before the election of 2020, the start of the year, last year. And I should have probably included that in the history, which I didn't. Okay, I just want to acknowledge that. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Sean. And just thanks, Angela. I'm conscious you have to go now. And I suppose I just want to say you raise a very, I suppose, welcome point, that you say there's significant support. And going back to Sean Ward's last point, that now we have an opportunity to get some answers to the questions so many people have around basic income. And the final point you mentioned there, the how, the who, the why. So I'm going to get back to that now and get back to some of the questions. And Sean Ward in particular, there's a couple of questions there in the chat regarding the other payments, things like the qualified child allowance, the importance of, you know, making that, I suppose, clear to people were they to engage in the pilot. And then there's a question there around the pension. Could the pension be listed along the other payments, so that the artists receiving it will know that they are eligible? So that's, I suppose, I'd like some thoughts on that question. And then the issues that Michael Taft raised as well, and was also raised by a number of other people in the question and answer. Why not refundable tax credits? And why withdraw it at the rate of 170,000 if it's included in the tax system? Should the taxation system not balance that out? So Sean Ward, I'll go to you first for answers to those.
Okay, there are only a few questions there, Michelle. Okay, okay. The qualified children's allowance and other payments from social welfare would all continue to be available. Okay, there's none of these things are going to be withdrawn. In some cases, the supplements would have to be carefully, looked at to make sure that they are adequate, to make sure that nobody is worse off. With regard to the pensions, like we took a kind of a shortcut here, in the sense that we looked at the job assistance scheme that's run by social welfare for artists. Okay, and we just took our criteria from that. Like, there's nothing in principle which says that, if you're on a pension, that you couldn't have your pension as a basic income. Do you know what I mean? And go into the trial. Like, that'd be a kind of a detail that'd be worked out. With regard to refundable tax credits, like they can be introduced in parallel. Like, refundable tax credits wouldn't be introduced for artists; they'd be introduced right across society, the same way that tax allowances were turned into tax credits about 15 years ago. The existing tax credits could be turned into refundable tax credits in the same way, and it's the kind of thing that would happen in the next budget, the budget after. It can happen in any budget, and the costs of it aren't high. So it's a parallel endeavour rather than something specific to the pilot. And the business of withdrawing the basic income payment from people who are very high market incomes, well, there's really no reason to leave it with them. If somebody is earning 170,000 euros a year on the market income, why would you? You have to husband your resources, and really, it is important from the point of view of funding the scheme that the basic income will be withdrawn. There's also another anomaly in the system, which is that if you leave people on very high incomes with basic income, then you find it very difficult to get a very high effective tax rate on. You know what I mean? Whereas if you withdraw it, you can get a 50% effective tax rate, which is the tax rate you should have on people in very high incomes, right? But if you leave them with basic income, it can be difficult to achieve that.
Thanks, Sean. Now, I have a question. First, I'm going to put it was to Sean Ward and Michael Taffin. I'm going to put it to Michael Taffin. It's about control groups, Michael, because you spoke about this. Do you think you could have a control group in a pilot in terms of where you have some artists receiving it and some who don't? Or what sort of survey questions would you use to evaluate the pilot to prove the additional and attributable benefits to receiving the UBI? Then for Sean Healy, I suppose, given your first presentation, there's a question here for an outsider, or for an outside perspective, and we do have people from Canada, Scotland and beyond here. Where does your Parliament stand generally, and are there members of Parliament, members of the Oireachtas, who can get behind study or general adoption of basic income? So Michael, I'll go to you first and then Sean. Sorry, Michael, you're muted.
There's no doubt that having a control group for arts workers would be more difficult than control groups that have been used in other basic income trials. For instance, in Finland, they had a control group, but they were just dealing with unemployed. So you get a like for like in terms of youth, gender, location, length of time of unemployed, and you don't have that many variables. That's not to say it's not difficult, but you don't have that many variables. With a control group for arts workers, you would have to line up the actual activity, the actual artist activity, previous income, because you couldn't have a control group where they all made a whole lot more money than those who didn't, those who are getting the basic income. So it would be, to balance the compositional effect to a range of things, especially the occupational detail, income detail, household circumstances detail. That would be difficult. But by the way, that's what social scientists do all the time. So, I mean, just because something is difficult to achieve doesn't mean that it can't be achieved. And, the perfect is the enemy of the good. You sometimes may not be able to get a perfect focus group parallel, but if it's robust enough and you have an uncertainty index or an uncertainty caveat of about, say, 5 or 10%, you then are in a stronger position to then make certain judgments about the impact of the basic income payment on those as opposed to those who didn't get it.
Thanks, Michael. And I think we made some very good points there about the great being the enemy of the good, and we shouldn't be striving for perfection. We should be looking for a robust pilot and control group. Now, Sean Healy, onto the political support for basic income. You might give a brief history.
If I might just go back to Michael's question, there is an issue about if you decide that you're going to have that pilot, that I have no problem with what you're saying about it can be done, that you can sort of say take so many thousand people, do it, and then so many thousand in a control group, and you can match them and so on. And as you say, social scientists do this all the time. The catch, however, is some people will get on it and some people won't. And I think the report that the artist did was very focused on making sure everybody got access to it. So that's it. And then therefore you have to do the evaluation in a bit of a different way. But I think those things can be worked out, though, and I think they can be worked out to the satisfaction of serious social policy analysts and social scientists generally, you know. Back to the parliamentarians, just to go back to the point that I was making earlier on, there were at least 2 political parties who were positive, who had included basic income in their election manifesto the last time round. As I pointed out in the historical review that I did at the beginning, the Labour Party had actually recommended they were going to putting in a white paper on basic income if they were elected. But now that was over 20 years ago, but just that the party was there. There are certainly parliamentarians as well as political parties who would champion basic income. Some of them are on this call or on this webinar today, and they're adding various things to the chat and they're from more than one political party as well, you know. But I think there's serious there is serious potential for engagement there. Historically, just to make one final point, historically, there was a study done. It's referenced in Colette's presentation. It's in that list of references. It's a thing called, the publication was called, it was falling into basic income or something. I can't remember what it was, or falling backwards into basic income or something. I can't remember. But it was a study of Britain and Ireland, commissioned by Roundtree back in the day, and they actually looked at the public awareness of basic income in the UK and Ireland, and also they looked at the actual knowledge at a parliamentary level in Britain and in Ireland, and they found a much higher level of sort of awareness of basic income in Ireland, and a much higher understanding of basic income among parliamentarians in Ireland. However, since then, there has been a lot of work done by people, a lot of it in Scotland, but not just in Scotland, in Britain as well. And they people who have done very good work on basic income and on communicating it well, so that there are movements now in England and in Scotland promoting basic income. And in fact, the Scottish Parliament is looking at it quite seriously to do some kind of a pilot within in Scotland. And interestingly enough, the Basic Income Earth Network annual world conference that they hold is actually being held in Scotland this year. So just these things will tie together, I'm sure.
Thanks, Sean. Now, there's a couple of interesting points actually made in the Q&A from, I suppose, around the control group. One person had a very, I suppose, interesting point with, you know, about a county profile, for example, looking at a geographical spread. I think that certainly could be something to be considered. I suppose I'm going to put a question to you, Sean Ward. It's the one question that hasn't been asked, and I'm really surprised it hasn't been asked yet. It's why now? Why do you think since 2016, since the conference where you did present like the costings for basic income for Ireland, why do you think we've moved from the radical utopia discussion to, yes, we can actually do it, here is how you would do it? What things have come together to make this not just a political possibility, but, you know, but a real and practical policy solution?
Well, I suppose there are a number of things going on here. One is a fairly recent phenomenon, which is the idea of the pandemic and the kind of possibilities that are there. And I think a lot of people are finding that policies are now being implemented that were considered unthinkable just even 2 years ago. So that's an immediate thing that's in the zeitgeist just at the moment. More generally, I think it's quite an achievement for the political parties to put it into the programme for government to have a pilot. So that's never happened before, and there's a lot of credit due to the political parties who actually negotiated it in there. And I think the impact of the artists is really important here, because this is the first group that's organised itself in such a way that they have a consistent campaign, as Angela mentioned, for the last 5 years. And that they stuck with it, and through the task force, they've managed to get a serious sort of profiling and a commitment there as well. So I think that, and then having a green minister in charge of the arts is also an opportunity as well. So these are all things that are happening together now, and not even one of them has happened in the past on its own. So it's a major opportunity, and the really important thing is to actually be aware that governments come and go. Sometimes they last, sometimes they don't. And the best time to implement a commitment in a programme for government is now. It's not next year or the year after. It's as soon as possible, because you never know, and nobody knows when that government goes. And when that government goes, all the commitments go as well. Okay, so it's a question of moving at speed.
Thanks, Sean. And I think you say that the time is now. The stars have almost aligned in a way in terms of getting it into the programme for government, the recommendations of the Arts and Cultural Recovery Task Force and the Minister. So I think, yes, now is the time to move forward. So first of all, I just want to thank all the people who've stayed for the hour and a half. It was fantastic to have people from not only Ireland, but North America, Europe, and across our friends, and I know some friends from Basic Income, Annie Miller in particular, I want to say hello to, who've joined us. And we'll bring it to a close now, just to let you all know that the presentations will be available on our website in the coming days. We really want to thank you all for attending the webinar, and I suppose now the push is on to actually make delivering the pilot a reality. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all the panelists, to Sean Ward, Sean Healy, Colette Bennett, Angela Dorgan, who had to leave us, and Michael Taft.